In this video, I'm going to talk about the relationship between communication, social media, happiness, and loneliness. And in particular, I'm going to talk about how we can use our digital devices to communicate in a way that maximizes our happiness and life satisfaction and minimizes our sense of loneliness. Hi everybody, I'm Bruce Lambert from HowCommunicationWorks.com. This is a channel where I teach you about communication skills so you can improve your relationships, succeed at work, and be more confident. So if you're already perfectly happy and never lonely, and you're totally satisfied with the role that social media and your digital devices play in your life, this video is not for you. You can click this off and congratulations to you for being so happy and not lonely and for having a perfect relationship with your digital devices. But for all the rest of us who don't feel completely satisfied with our lives, who maybe are not completely happy, maybe even a little bit depressed, and maybe a little bit lonely, and not satisfied with the way these digital devices, our smartphones, fit into our lives, I want to talk to you. If that describes you, then this video is for you. In particular, I want to talk about how it could be that we have these digital devices, these smartphones and tablets and laptops and everything else, that on the one hand make us more connected than we've ever been before, and yet on the other hand, for many of us, still we feel lonelier than we've ever felt before. There's all this digital connection, and yet there's this sense of actual social disconnection, which manifests as depression and loneliness and also as anxiety. As usual, I was motivated to talk about this topic because of things that I've been reading. I'm sort of constantly reading about communication, both for my job and because I'm looking for things to talk with you folks about. But in this case, an article caught my eye about the relationship between small talk, deep conversations, and happiness. The article's title is called Eavesdropping on Happiness, and I'll link below to the article. I think it might be behind a paywall. If it is, you could at least read the abstract, but I'm going to summarize the main points from the article here. So first of all, in this article, they used a really interesting technique. They had these sort of voice activated, they weren't even voice activated, there's electronically activated recorders. They call them the EAR, the ear, an electronically activated recorder, which people, volunteers who give their consent, volunteer to have this thing and carry it around with them. And then at random times during the day, it simply turns on for a couple of minutes and records whatever ambient sound is in the person's environment, whether that's a conversation or television or whatever it is. And then the researchers go back later on, and if there's a conversation, they transcribe the conversation, and they can tell whether it was a deep and meaningful conversation or whether it was small talk or whether the person was alone. At the same time, they can give people measures of life satisfaction and depression and anxiety and other measures of kind of well-being. And in that way, they can correlate how the number of deep conversations or the number of shallow small talk conversations people have, how that's related to their life satisfaction or their happiness or their loneliness or whatever the case may be. And to summarize these results very briefly, it turns out that, and perhaps not surprisingly, the more deep conversations you have, the greater your life satisfaction or happiness. And it didn't matter how many small talk, sort of shallow conversations you had. Those did not predict life satisfaction, or those were not correlated with life satisfaction. So the main conclusion from a study like this is it is the quality of the conversations, not the quantity of the conversations, that leads to life satisfaction and that combats loneliness and depression and so on. Well, how does this relate to social media? I was reading yet another book. I was reading Cal Newport's new book called Digital Minimalism, which is an excellent book. I've read other Cal Newport books, especially the one on deep work, and it's highly recommended. I'll link to both of those books down below, and I suggest you read them or listen to them or however you consume books. They're both excellent. But in this book, Digital Minimalism, he's making the case that we should basically use our smartphones a lot less, that we should be much more intentional about when we do use our smartphones. There are lots of reasons for this, and you can read the book yourself to hear his entire argument. But one of the reasons is he thinks that it cheapens our conversations, that the availability of text messaging, social media likes, and comments gives us the illusion of social connection, but without the actual substance of a real conversation. And he borrows this idea also from Sherry Turkle, who's another author who writes about the negative effects that digital technologies may have on our genuine social connections. Sherry Turkle and Cal Newport both use a contrast. They contrast connection with conversation. And connection is this thing that digital devices can enhance. So with digital devices, I can be connected to all these people that I knew in high school, or people that I lived with or knew briefly in college, or used to know on the job, or were my neighbors when I was growing up, people with whom I have only peripheral and relatively superficial connections in most cases. Now, some of those people are my dear friends, but most are just kind of peripheral and superficial social connections. But because of Facebook and Twitter and Instagram and Snapchat and texting and everything else, we can maintain the illusion that we actually have relationships with these people when all we really have are digital connections. Well, Sherry Turkle summarizes a bunch of research, and Cal Newport talks about it as well, that seems to suggest that these digital connections are actually no substitute for real relationships. And this research that I just talked about, Eavesdropping on Happiness, would substantiate that in a way, because it shows that it's only the deep conversations, substantive conversations, that correlate with subsequent measures of life satisfaction or happiness. Small talk, which we could also sort of equate with these kind of shallow, superficial connections we tend to make on social media, clicking the like button, offering a little comment on social media, or texting, these are not the same thing. And Cal Newport and Sherry Turkle make this sort of long argument about our brains and the way that real conversations require us to process complex analog cues about tone of voice and posture, gesture, facial expression, and so on, that engages our brains in a much deeper way than sort of simply clicking a like. But if we just think about it intuitively, the thing that's most obvious to me intuitively is that I spend too much time on my phone like most people. It's shocking when my iPhone now gives me these statistics about how long I've been on my phone, and I'm just embarrassed and ashamed to think about how long I've been on my phone. And at the same time, often after a long time of being on my phone, I will feel empty and I will feel lonely. I won't feel connected, even though that whole time, let's say I've been scrolling through Twitter and commenting and connecting. At the end, when I put the phone down, I'll feel really empty, like that time was wasted, and that like I'm not a better person, I'm not more enriched from that experience, but I'm actually a worse person. I've been depleted. I'm less than I was before I engaged in that long bout of social media use. And if I talk to my kids, they use different social media like Instagram, they tell me the same thing, that it's sort of depleting. And I think many of you have probably had that experience as well. So what's the message? These digital devices, because they promote shallow connection, and because we spend so much time on these digital devices, what they tend to do is crowd out the opportunity for real, substantive, especially face-to-face or telephone conversations, the real conversations, not just connections, that nourish us spiritually and make us feel genuinely connected and actually combat this sense of loneliness that many of us might feel when we spend too much time in the digital world. So social media use crowds out either face-to-face or telephone conversations, and yet it's these face-to-face and telephone conversations which give us what we need, which actually counteract loneliness and depression and increase our life satisfaction. So in a nutshell, the answer is to use social media less, to use our digital devices less, not to use them not at all. Many of us have to stay connected with work and family under certain circumstances. Cal Newport, his entire book is about how you can do a digital declutter and minimize and use them intentionally, not go off them completely, though some of you may choose to do that. But the idea is to use them much more intentionally. And in particular, Cal Newport talks about conversation-centered communication strategy, which is a strategy to decrease your shallow connection kinds of social media use and promote the use of these devices for deeper conversations. And I'll just give you a few of those strategies before closing. The first strategy is don't click, don't comment on social media. I know this will seem like heresy to many of you, but he says, don't click, don't comment, because clicking and commenting gives us the illusion that we're engaged in some sort of meaningful social interaction, when in fact, we're not. It doesn't typically give us the reward that we're looking for. In fact, it may have the opposite effect and make us feel sort of empty and lonely. So don't click, don't comment. I know there's many objections to this. Many of you won't be able to do it. I myself may not be able to do it, but that's the suggestion because we want to avoid this illusion that we're actually engaged in something meaningful when we're not. Cal Newport's second suggestion is be less available over text. Don't carry on long conversations over text. I have a close friend who I talk to all the time over text, but she hates texting. And she'll often tell me, especially if we get into a kind of meaningful topic, I hate texting. I don't want to talk about this over text. So I myself could learn a lot from this lesson. So be less available over texting. Turn your phone on Do Not Disturb so you don't get these constant notifications, because texting is not a substitute for real conversations. I can text with people all day long and I don't really feel a deep connection to them, but I often talk on the telephone during my commute to my friend Kevin, and those conversations are really meaningful. So be less available for texting. The third idea, instead of texting, is use the telephone. Now, I know for young people, and a lot of my viewers, at least according to YouTube viewer statistics, are very young in the 25-year-old range. And if you're like my children, you don't like to talk on the telephone at all. In fact, you might be even afraid to talk on the telephone. The reason you're afraid to talk on the telephone is because the telephone is a higher bandwidth medium than texting or liking or commenting on social media. It requires more of you, and you may be less skilled at it because you spent too much of your time in social media. So this higher bandwidth connection requires you to pay attention to more cues. It demands more of you in terms of participation. It's more difficult, but it's much more rewarding because it's a more genuine, maybe that's not the right word. It's a more rewarding kind of human connection. I'll just put it that way. It gives you more back. At the end of a real conversation, like on the telephone, you will tend to feel more enriched, less alone than you will if you have the same conversation texting. So talk more on the telephone, substitute the phone for texting. And the last idea that Cal Newport gives is have conversation office hours where you can tell people when you'll almost always be available. And for me, it's like call me on the phone between 5:30 and 6:30 because that's when I tend to commute. That's the same example Cal Newport uses in his book to describe someone who did the same thing. I'm almost always available between 5:30 and 6:30 p.m. because I'm in my car commuting, and it's a great time to catch up with people over the telephone. So there you have it. There's a paradox in the world that we live in that we're more connected digitally than we've ever been before, and yet many of us are depressed, lonely, and anxious nevertheless. I think these things are related to one another. I don't think that the iPhone and smartphones cause every social problem in the world. I think most of that research has been debunked, and I'll probably make a video about that. But I do think it's the case, and I think there's good evidence to show that social media use, smartphone use crowds out other forms of social interaction, and more direct, authentic forms of social interaction like face-to-face conversation or telephone calls are likely to be more rewarding and do more to relieve us of these feelings of loneliness and depression and anxiety that many of us suffer. So I've given you a few tips about minimizing texting, not using liking and commenting, and talking more on the telephone, making more time for face-to-face conversation. I think you'll be happier and less lonely. I hope you give it a try. If you do, leave me some comments down below. Share this video, subscribe to our channel if you like this kind of content. Go on over to howcommunicationworks.com. Give us your email and we'll send you an ebook about empathy, which I think you'll find to be useful and educational. Thanks so much for watching. We'll catch you next time.